Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. So, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us for Which Grass is Which. Today is day 3 of our webinar series, and we're going to be focused on nuisance grass identification. As a reminder, or if you're new joining us today, my name is Erin Garrett. I'm a natural resource, environment, and energy educator. I'm based in far southern Illinois, but happy to be talking to you about grass identification for all of Illinois today. So I know we have folks joining from outside the state. We're going to be focused in on grasses you can find in Illinois. Of course, they can be found in other areas of the country too. Just a couple housekeeping things. If you downloaded this presentation before noon yesterday as a handout, there are some changes that were made. So I had issue saving it that I didn't realize it didn't save a bunch of my changes when I was working on this last week, and realized it yesterday and had to go back through and change things. So you may want to re-download that. One of the main things you're going to see if you have that printed handout is just kind of a different order of the slides. Only a little bit of the information has changed. So I apologize for that. Bear with me and we'll get through it. As a reminder, this is being recorded. We'll send you that link once it is available for you to rewatch again or share out. And we will have an evaluation at the end of today. If you would be able to take that, we really appreciate your feedback. And we'll also email that out to you so you don't have to, if you can't stick around to the end, we'll get you that link and would appreciate your feedback. But we're going to get started kind of in the same way we did yesterday, with just kind of a refresher on grass ID terminology. So if you've been here the last 2 days, you'll have heard this twice. This is time 3, but just so we're all on the same page with our terms, our approach to grass identification for this session is to use field-based characteristics that for many of us we can observe without a hand lens. Some of us that have not the best eyesight might benefit from a little bit of a hand lens, but we're not going to be using super complex terms or need to be in a lab looking under a microscope. So that means we're not going to be as technical. We're not going to have as many specific measurements of grass parts, but we're going to try to keep it as approachable and user-friendly as possible. So we're going to jump right in and start with a brief review of our terms so we're on the same page because we're going to use these on each grass we talk about today. So looking at our line drawing on the right of the screen, the stem or the backbone of the grass is called a stem. You can also see the word culm, although I don't use that one usually. What you think of as a leaf has 3 parts. The blade, which is the typical leafy part, and then that blade wraps around the stem, forming a structure called a sheath. Okay. The bottom of that sheath is going to be a swelling called a node. I like to think of it as the kneecap of a grass. Okay. So on this one down here, we can see a blade, a sheath, and a node. Okay. Important to be able to differentiate between when you're looking at a stem or a sheath, because sometimes there's different characteristics, colors, hairs that you can find on different parts of that. So being able to differentiate between them is important. This area right here where the leaf blade becomes the sheath is a region we call the collar region. We're going to look for some identification characteristics in there. That can be ligules, auricles, and horns. We'll talk about those on the next slide. And then that whole top portion of the grass is called the inflorescence. That's the flowering part of the grass. And we'll look at that in a second too. Okay, so one of those identification characteristics we're going to look for in that collar region is a ligule. And a ligule typically is a membrane or a collection of hairs. It's not always there. So if it's not there, it's going to look something like this, just kind of a smooth, raised area, U-shaped area. Okay. It's kind of a win if you don't find a ligule. We're actually going to look at this grass today, barnyard grass, that doesn't have a ligule. But more often than not, you're going to find some variation of hairs or a membrane. Hairs can be velvety like here. They can be bristly. They can be tall or short. Membranes also vary in height. Sometimes they vary in how well they stay intact. We'll look at some today that shred very easily. And they usually start off white and then turn yellow, orange, or brown and wither away as you get later into the fall. So ligules great early in the season, still reliable mid to mid-season. As you get later in the season, you're going to have to look for some other clues in addition to a ligule to have accuracy with your identification in some cases. Okay, two other structures we're going to look at, auricles and horns. Auricles are essentially little arms that come out from that leaf sheath and hug the stem. We find that in groups like the wheatgrasses or the rye. And then horns is something specific to Indian grass that we talked about yesterday. So I'm not going to focus on that because we're not going to talk about that one today. Okay, that top part of the grass is the inflorescence. It's the flowering portion. That's the same term we use for other flowering plants as well. And then a few different breakdown of terms on this structure. So here, that stem turns into the rachis. So where we start having our spikelets, we're going to see that stem turn into the rachis. Sometimes there's little stalks. We can call those pedicels. And then the flowering unit of a grass is called a spikelet. Okay. Spikelets can be very, very tiny. They can be quite large. They have a lot of different parts and pieces. And that's where a lot of the technical grass ID comes in, is looking at the individual pieces of a spikelet. For the most part, we're not going to do that. We're going to look at a couple things like awns and bristles, but we're not going to look at individual components of the spikelet. But just know that's where you have all of your flowering parts and pieces, and that's where your seeds are going to develop. Okay, but there are a couple things we can find around or on our spikelets. One is something called bristles, which we see in plants like the foxtails, and we're going to look at those today. They emerge from the bottom of a spikelet and are usually found in multiples. So in this line drawing here, the piece that would be attached to our rachis, or our stem of our inflorescence, and we have some bristles around there. So if we plucked off some of those spikelets on our foxtail, we'd find them sitting in a nest of bristles. The one that's more common is awns. And they're bristle-like structures, but they emerge from the tip of a spikelet rather than the base. They vary in size, shape, color, number. So ones that we can see here, these are kind of shorter individual awns. We've got kind of paired longer awns, and then awns can even be quite long, multiple inches long. Okay, when we look at identifying the type of inflorescence, the way those spikelets are arranged, we can break that down into three different categories, and we can do that by asking ourselves some paired questions. So our first paired question that we would ask is our rachis branched or unbranched? If it's branched, we're going to have a panicle. A panicle can look different, have different variations. The left line drawing is kind of the more standard panicle. If you think of like a Kentucky bluegrass, a lot of us know what that looks like in bloom. That's got a very typical panicle shape. But this one over here, you can see all those branches are kind of held to the side. It's another form of a panicle. But the key is there's branches on it. If our rachis is unbranched, we can ask another paired question. Are our spikelets held on pedicels or little stalks, or are they directly attached to the rachis? If it's the latter, then it's a spike. This is maybe the most simple. A spike has all of those spikelets directly attached to that rachis or that stem of your inflorescence. If they are held on little pedicels, we call it a raceme. A raceme is kind of a catch-all category between our panicle and our spike. So over here, kind of the more typical or the easy to understand presentation of a raceme is that you have spikelets held on little pedicels. But a lot of the times what we see is this finger-like collection of spikelets that's together held on a little pedicel or stalk, like in a crabgrass, a big blue stem, a gamagrass. Those all have racemes. Okay. It can be challenging and difficult to tell if something is a pedicel or a branch, right? There's some muddiness there. And as we've talked about this week, not everyone agrees on which one we're looking at. So you might have a raceme-like panicle, a spike-like raceme. There's wiggle room with those. But in general, I'm going to put up here just kind of our overview description of each of these different types of inflorescences. Okay. So if you've joined us earlier in the week, you know it's time for a quiz. So if you would like to put in the chat what type of inflorescence you think this grass has, we'll see how we're doing. All right, lots of answers getting entered in. I can tell it's day 3. We're doing excellent. We have most of us are saying panicle, and yes, that would be correct. This one's a little tricky because everything's kind of curved to one side. But yes, we would consider this to be a panicle with branches here. Okay, this is cheatgrass. We're going to look at that one today. Okay, grass number 2, panicle, raceme, or a spike. Drop your guess in the chat. All right. Again, can't fool you all. This is a spike. This is a yellow foxtail, another one we're going to look at today. And then this is going to be our last one we're going to look at. Okay, so I don't know. Is it just process of elimination or are we that good? I'm seeing Racine in the chat, and yes, you are correct. I was a little more creative earlier in the week, but just put these 3 examples up for you today. So in this case, these are going to be those finger-like collections of spikelets that are then attached to our rachis. Okay, this is going to be a stiltgrass, another one we'll look at today. Okay, so I'm going to pause right here. That was really quick, but again, hopefully is like a double review that we've had so far. Are there any general grass ID term questions? Any general grass ID questions that you have so far? If you have one, put it in the chat and we'll get those answered before we move on. Okay, so I'm seeing one that's come in. So yes, the spikelet is gonna be where you have your flowering reproductive structures. And then after it is wind pollinated, that's where your seeds are also going to develop. So all of that will take place in that spikelet. Okay. Not seeing any other questions, we'll dive into today's focus, which is going to be on our nuisance grasses. Okay. And I chose the word nuisance kind of intentionally because these grasses typically um, are context dependent, considered to be undesirable. Okay. We're going to be looking at native grasses, non-native grasses, and invasive grasses. And depending on the context we're looking at, they can be a problem. Okay. The context we're looking at today is going to be more of like looking at our natural native habitats, looking at restoration efforts. So some of the grasses we're going to look at are like pasture grasses, right? So if that's your intention, you're managing for those, then it's not a nuisance, right? But when that pasture then is being converted into a prairie restoration, they are a nuisance. So that's more of the lens that we're looking at today. So some of these could have fit into the other sessions, but we're just going to We're going to go with this classification. Our native and our non-native grasses can exhibit weedy tendencies, so they can be nuisance. All of our invasives have those traits, those nuisance traits, but invasive is more of a specific definition, right? So when we talk about invasives, they are non-native, they were intentionally or unintentionally introduced, and they're causing environmental or economic harm or harm to humans, right? So that's our more specific definition. Um, I have some today that are labeled as invasive, so I'm kind of following like Illinois regulations as well as the Midwest invasive plant list that um, the Midwest Invasive Plant Network put out for Illinois. So again, it can depend, and if you're in a different state, you might be like, well, we treat that as invasive or we don't. So all of it's a little bit flexible, okay? And really depends on your context. So I just kind of wanted to set that up before we get into them today. And then we are going to focus primarily on identification. So I know a lot of folks have management questions when it comes to maybe managing for these managing to get rid of these grasses. Chris is going to drop in the chat a management guide that we have for invasive plants and pests in Illinois. If you do have some questions, Chris said he'd be willing to help answer those in the chat, but we're going to try to keep it focused on identification today. And then we're going to cover 23 plants. So we've got a lot to go. So we're going to jump right in and get started with those grasses today. All right, so our first one we're going to look at is giant foxtail. This is one of two foxtails we're going to look at today, and there are about 6 different species of them in Illinois. They are all non-native and like disturbed areas. This one, giant foxtail, is going to stand out primarily with its height and kind of the way that it holds its spike. Okay. So this one and our next foxtail, they're both going to be summer annuals. This one is going to have broader leaf blades with some short hairs on them. It's going to have a hairy ligule. And if you've been joining us today, most of our ligules are membranous, so that's going to make it stand out a little bit from some other grasses. And then our inflorescence is going to be a spike that curves downward once it's mature. So as this grass, as it's pushing out its spike and just starting to bloom, it might hold that spike up straight, but over time should curve downward. Each of our spikelets is small and round, and they're surrounded by bristles. And in the giant foxtail, it's typically 1 to 3 bristles underneath an individual spikelet. And that's going to be an important identification characteristic to tell it apart from some of the other foxtails. You can see our map here, found in every county in Illinois. Okay, let's take a look. Over here, we can see that ligule of those kind of stiff, bristly hairs. We got kind of just a few views of those leaves here, broader at the base and then tapering to that point. These tend to have kind of a more translucent midrib on them, translucent to green midrib. Okay, and then a few close-ups of that spike, right? So all of those spikelets are attached to that rachis, and then they have just a few bristles underneath each of them. I don't sure showcasing that individually, but a couple different views of giant foxtail. So keep that one in mind. We're going to switch to our second one. This one is yellow foxtail. Okay. Yellow foxtail is another non-native summer annual. We can see this one can stay a little bit shorter, so it can get up to 3 feet tall, whereas the giant can get up to 4 feet tall. And this one we're going to find, anywhere from your lawn to pastures to other disturbed areas. And to tell it apart from giant foxtail, we're going to look for kind of some long hairs on the leaf blades, usually near the base of them, and maybe in that collar region, so right here as well. We're going to find a hairy ligule again. And again, we're going to find a spike in fluorescence. In this case, it usually remains upright. You can kind of see in the background here, these are kind of arching, but if you look, it's like the whole stem that's arching rather than that spike. The bristles can vary in color, so that's not really a reliable way to tell them apart from one another. And then the spikelets are going to be very similar, but they typically have 5 to 15 um, individual bristle or grouping of bristles underneath each spikelet. Okay, there's another foxtail that's supposed to be really common, which is green foxtail. And those spikelets are supposed to have just a few bristles on them, like the giant foxtail. I've never seen it, so either that characteristic differentiation isn't accurate or it's super common and I've just never seen it. But I note that green foxtail because yellow and green, those colors don't mean anything. They can both have yellow bristles and green bristles, and those different characteristics. So that color name sometimes is helpful, but in the foxtails is not. Here we can see our distribution is in every county in Illinois, on this map. Okay, so a couple close-up views. This one here, this specific one, that hairy ligule isn't really present. So remember, we can't always count on that as an identification characteristic. And then these also don't have those hairs, so it's not always there. Okay, but when it is in bloom, very easy to be able to identify it with that spike. Again, you can see kind of variations in the different bristle colors. This one here is in bloom. That's why you see all of that purple kind of hanging out that's been pushed out of those spikelets. So that one is in bloom and flower trying to get wind pollinated. Okay, we're going to move into a couple in another genus, the Hordeum genus, some barleys. And these are going to be native, but considered weedy in a lot of instances. So this first one is Squirreltail barley. It prefers disturbed areas, so I would see it in kind of prairie restoration settings. This one I found in a lawn, a big patch of it that had popped up. It is a cool season grass. So again, if you've joined us, you should be hopefully remember what a cool season grass is, but those grasses are going to do most of their growth early in the spring and then flower late spring into early summer. As we get to more to this time of the year, they're going to die back or senesce and kind of change color. These are pretty short, okay? Usually under 2 feet tall. I typically see them under 1 foot tall. And we can look for a short membranous ligule. But really, what's going to do it for this one is to see it in bloom, right? It's very distinctive. It has that spike. It's going to nod to one side, but it has all of those long awns, okay? And they're really silky if you were able to run your hand on them. And it looks like a squirrel's tail. I've also heard it as foxtail barley. So whatever furry critter you want the tail to use as your reference works for this one. More of not really as much in southern Illinois, although through a few scattered counties, but you can find it throughout the rest of the state. Okay, here's a close-up of that ligule that you can find. We have kind of shorter leaf blades that comes with kind of that shorter size. And then again, a couple close-up views of that spike with all of those awns that are present in this one. Also note we talked about in some other grasses that like awns can be held in different arrangements or maybe curve. These are all going to be held straight, so they're not going to curve as they mature or anything like that. They're all going to kind of remain in that straight form. Okay. Another related barley is little barley. Again, it is a native, but we kind of find it in more of those disturbed areas. I've even seen it growing kind of in like a gravel path that we have around a garden. So it can definitely be in more of your like home landscape too. This one is going to be rather short again, so usually under a foot tall. I say typically like 6 inches is how tall I see it. And it is a spring annual, so it is going to green up and grow and bloom in the spring. Just like our last one, it's going to have a short membranous ligule and a spike in fluorescence. In this case, it's going to pretty closely resemble more of like a cultivated barley. You're going to see all of those awns held close to that rachis with short little awns. So this one you might confuse it more with like a Virginia wild rye, which we talked about a couple days ago, just with kind of the shape of that spike in fluorescence, how those awns are held upright, the whole inflorescence is held upright. But we would look for the lack of auricles, those little arms in the little barley. It's not going to have them, whereas that Virginia wild rye would. Virginia wild rye is going to have that twisted leaf tendency, whereas little barley isn't. So just a couple hints to tell those two apart. And then height and kind of timing is going to be a little bit spaced out, right? This has a spring annual. Virginia wild rye is a cool season grass. They'll be up around the same time, but this one might be flowering a little earlier. Again, kind of similar distribution on our maps here as the last one. Okay, a couple close-up views. It does grow in a bunch. I don't think I mentioned that one already. We can kind of see this is in comparison to like some white clover here. You can kind of get more of a size clue. So short little leaves, and then all of the little spikes that are out as it flowers. And again, this is growing in a gravel lot along with a lot of other weedy plants. Kind of a close-up of that membranous ligule. And then again, just short little leaves, and we see that little spike. Okay. This photo, this is not typical. This one was nodding to the side. Most of the time they're going to be held straight up, but you can kind of see that closer view of all of those spikelets packed together with their awns. Little barley. Okay, we're going to do a quiz based on those four that we did. Go ahead and put in the chat what two grasses do we have here. You can do A for the first one and B for the second one. All right. Okay, so our A over here is going to be our squirreltail barley. We said it could also be called a foxtail, and if it's called a foxtail, it's called a foxtail barley, not to be confused with yellow foxtail over here. Common names are great. We love them. There's so many different options, right? But actually, they can be quite confusing. So just keep that in mind. Our left one here is our squirreltail barley, barley being the key answer in that, and this one over here being our yellow foxtail. Okay, they can be confusing, right? They look really similar, and they all like to grow together a lot of the times too, so it can be challenging. Okay, we're going to move into the bluegrasses in the Poa genus. Okay, we're going to look at three. There are 18 in Illinois. They all kind of have a similar look, and we're going to look at kind of the more common, two of the more common ones, and one that maybe we want to pay attention to because it's a little bit of a spreading one that we're finding now. So Kentucky bluegrass, right? It's from Kentucky. No, it's not. It's actually non-native. And of course, this is intentionally planted by a lot of us, right? As a lawn grass. So functions great in that system, but What we find in a lot of cases, like in prairie restoration, is Kentucky bluegrass is kind of just there, like throughout the entire restoration. I know when I was doing my master's research and I was out in southern Illinois grasslands and putting out little plots and identifying all the plants in them, there was a lot of Kentucky bluegrass and it was just kind of there, not really changing or moving plant community types, but just there. And I was like, what is up with this? So it is definitely out and you will see it in places outside of your lawn, like disturbed areas, lower quality prairies, open woodlands, things like that. It is a cool season grass, as a lot of us know from our lawns. And if we're not mowing it constantly, it can get up to 2 feet tall. So it's going to look a little different than what we're used to in a lawn setting. One thing with this bluegrass that's helpful in telling it apart from some others is that it has a round stem. There's another bluegrass that looks very similar that has a flattened stem. That's Canada bluegrass. So one way to tell those two apart. And then in the bluegrasses, we're going to look for kind of long, thin leaves. And we say that they have a keeled tip, or a boat-shaped tip. So that's kind of the photograph that I have here. It kind of looks like the front of a canoe, right? Kind of that boat-shaped tip, where that leaf is kind of folded in together. It's going to have a short membranous ligule and then a panicle inflorescence, and it is found throughout the entire state. Okay, so a few other views, close up of the leaves. I was always taught that the mid rib looks like train tracks, so like two tracks together. I don't remember what we used to differentiate that, what other plant we were differentiating it from, but we would use that for Kentucky bluegrass. And then over here, you can see when that inflorescence is in full bloom, it has that panicle, it's kind of puffed out, right? We can see those branches and all those little spikelets. But then as it senesces or it dies back, it's going to kind of contract that back up, turn more of that straw color. So depending on when you're seeing it, so later in the season, like late summer, early fall, it's going to look like that because it's a cool season grass, right? You can see all the green foliage behind us here. That's more of our warm season grasses. Okay, so Kentucky bluegrass. Next is annual bluegrass, Poa annua. Again, non-native, cool season grass. This one we typically find more in our highly managed landscapes. So in our gardens, in sidewalk cracks, and other disturbed areas. This one I find a lot in my gardens. Typically under a foot tall, I'd say even under 6 inches tall. Very, very short. Winter to spring annual. So this one can green up and start growing like very, very late fall or early spring, late winter, and then be blooming. I think this, if I remember correctly, this photo with my glove, this was in like February and it was already in Southern Illinois. It was already in flower. So very early grass. You can see it is a bunch grass, and it has that kind of those same characteristics. We're going to have thin leaves with a keeled tip. We're going to have a short membranous ligule and a panicle inflorescence that, as we keep going along, you'll see is just kind of the characteristic bluegrass panicle. Scattered throughout the state of Illinois. Wouldn't surprise me if it was in every county and it's just underreported. Okay, so a few views. We've got that little ligule. Again, we can see those leaves. These tend to be a little bit broader than that Kentucky bluegrass, right? But we still come together and have that keeled point at the end of them. And then you can see again that panicle fully open with our branches out. And that is going to be it in flower. Annual bluegrass. Okay, the third one that we're gonna look at looks a little bit different. It looks kind of funky. This one's bulbous bluegrass. Okay. This one is non-native. We find it in kind of disturbed areas and woodland edges. So where I found this was kind of on a trail at a state park, walking in the woods, looked over and was like, that's the craziest grass I've ever seen. What is that? Found that it is a non-native. and kind of newer to the state of Illinois, at least with the reporting that we currently have. So this one here is reported in EdMaps. That's what this source of maps is. So that's going to be the more updated, taking in like observations from land managers, folks like you, iNaturalist, putting all of that data in, as well as a lot of other data research that's happening. And that's going to be our most current distribution of this one. It looks like I didn't report it because I found it in Johnson County. So it should be green there too. But this one, again, a lot of same characteristics just that we have of the bluegrasses. Hopefully you're starting to pick those up by now. Cool season, bunchgrass, relatively short. Long thin leaves, keeled tip, short membranous ligule. But this panicle looks kind of different. So these spikelets are kind of funky. And they have a structure that's not technically an awn, because it kind of emerges from the base of the spikelet and it's not a bristle. It doesn't really fit into either of those, so we call it an awn-like structure emerging from the base of the spikelet. How do you like that description? But the base of those spikelets is also kind of swollen. So it gets just this kind of interesting look. It looks like, I don't know. I don't know what it looks like, but very unique, right? Very different. Here's a few other different views of it. So this grass as of itself, these little bunches, pretty nondescript, right? If I was looking for this and it wasn't in bloom, I'd look for that keeled tip, but that wouldn't tell me which bluegrass it is. And there are bluegrasses that grow in the woods that are native. So we'd want to that I believe are native. I said that, and I don't know that that's actually accurate. So there's other bluegrasses in the woods for sure. Don't know on their native versus non-native status. But if we saw this flowering, that would definitely stick out to us. Okay. Here again, we can see that membranous ligule. We can see that keeled tip. Okay. Bulbous bluegrass. We're going to move on to Redtop, which is kind of a bluegrass look-alike, except for kind of that color. But that color isn't always super reliable at every stage of growth of this grass. So redtop, another non-native, found in every county in the state. It likes more lower quality prairies or prairie restorations. It can handle some more moisture in the soil. And like the ones we've been looking at, is a cool season grass. Can get a little bit taller though. So this one can get, 2, 3 feet tall. It is rhizomatous rather than being a bunch grass. So it'll spread over time, and form little colonies. It does have short, broad leaves with pointed tips, but they're not keeled. Okay, so that's one way to tell it apart, from a bluegrass. It's still going to have a tall membranous ligule. And then it produces this panicle with red spikelets. Just from my time out in the field, I find that redtop has like a super, super tall membranous ligule. There was this grass that we were monitoring before it was in bloom, and that was the characteristic I saw, was like crazy tall ligule. Couldn't figure out what it was. Then the grass had what looked like this purple, almost black spike. And we were like, what is that? And then the next week it popped open and it looked like it does now, this panicle, right? But as it's being pushed out of the grass, it's held like a spike and then it pops open. And I was like, well, that's redtop. Now I need to go fix all my data sheets where we didn't know that that was redtop. So a few things, sometimes you can't tell, right? And then you go back and you're like, oh, now I know what it is. But a few of those characteristics you can see here. Look at that ligule. It's crazy. For a grass that's this small, super, super tall membranous ligule, that one always stands out to me, even more than a bluegrass, like twice the size of a bluegrass ligule. And then here we can kind of see that color, that reddish color on all of those spikelets held in this panicle. And then over here, just a view of kind of that leaf. So it's going to be not as linear as a Kentucky bluegrass, right? And not going to have that keel tip either. They also have kind of a silky texture to them. So different than a purple top that can be kind of silky, but also has that grease to it. When both of these before they've kind of fully developed that panicle, they could look a little similar, but this wouldn't have that grease. It's going to be a lot shorter too. So a few ways to tell those apart. Okay, the next one we're going to look at is called Nimblewill. You might know it as nimbleweed. That's another name for it that a lot of people use. But we're going to go with Nimblewill. It's in the Muhlenbergia genus, and there are, I want to say like 18, 14 different grasses in this genus. And it is a native grass, but as you could guess, by the fact that people call it nimbleweed, it is definitely pretty weedy. You can find it in a lot of different habitats. This picture was taken in the middle of the woods. These photos right here were taken in more of a low quality prairie restoration. And then I used to have it growing in my lawn as well. So it can show up in a lot of different spots. Depending on where it's growing, it's going to be a different height. Right in my lawn, it was never more than 4 inches tall, but it still bloomed at that height. But it can get up to like a foot and a half. It is a warm season grass. And it grows in colonies, it grows in big colonies, but not through spreading through rhizomes. What it does is it spreads by rooting at the lower nodes. So this grass will grow, it'll kind of flop over, it'll reroot, and then it'll keep traveling in that way. Okay, we can kind of see that here, this kind of horizontal stem that was on top of the ground rather than below the ground. Okay. Um, the leaves are held really strongly perpendicular to the stem. We kind of looked at this with another grass earlier in the series where we say that the leaves are held kind of like rungs on a ladder, so kind of perpendicular to that stem. And you can kind of see that presented well here. They're going to produce a narrow panicle that looks like a spike nearly all of the time. So here it's blooming, and you might be like, Erin, that's not a panicle. But technically it is. And then on our little spikelets, we're going to have some awns. You can kind of see the scattered distribution throughout the state. But let's take a closer look with my blurry picture because little grasses are hard to photograph. But if you were to kind of bend this structure, you would see there are branches in here. So I'm guessing at a certain time of the year, it kind of puffs that out a little bit, like most of our panicles. I've just never seen it. Every time I find it, it's those branches are held really tightly up, and it does look very spike-like. Again, when we're looking with this really close view, we can see those short little awns all along that grass. But these pictures over here, these big giant clumps of it, that's how it grows. And it does then pull pretty easily out of the ground because as you give it a tug, all of those upper those stems above the ground that have rooted, they kind of all tug up. So that's another kind of identification characteristic that you could use too. Okay, we're going to move into the crabgrasses. So common crabgrass, again, this is one that we're going to find a lot in our lawns. I find it whenever I get soil brought in, either in my garden for whatever project is happening, there's crabgrass in it. But you can also find it out in more, if you're on a hike, we can find crabgrass growing. So it can get, up to 3 feet tall. And it is a summer annual, so it's going to be blooming right about now. There are multiple different crabgrasses. This one is one of the most common, hence the name. You can see it's in every county in the state. There are four other types, though, too. This one is also sometimes called hairy crabgrass. So we have common or hairy crabgrass. And then another one that's really common is smooth crabgrass. So in my mind, we should just call them hairy and smooth because that helps you tell them apart. But common and hairy are the same. So what we're going to find are short, broad leaves with hairs on the blades as well as on the sheaths. And we can see that pretty well in this photo on the right. We have a short membranous ligule that's there but hard to see in this photo. And then we're going to get that raceme inflorescence with those finger-like collections of spikelets. Okay, that's kind of the characteristic crabgrass, right? Um, look. We also are going to categorize this as a bunch grass and as a creeping bunch grass because kind of like the last grass, its stems are going to reroot and then it will continue to spread in that way. So if you've weeded it from your garden and you go to pull up the bunch of it, you'll find that those branches, if you didn't get it quick enough, which I never tend to do, those branches have all kind of re-rooted, and it's a little bit more work to get all the pieces of that crabgrass out of the ground. Okay, I think this is the only slide I have for this one. I don't have a ton of pictures of this. For me, do we really need to tell the differences between the species of crabgrass? Probably not. If your purpose is it's crabgrass, so I want to eradicate it. So in this case, if you find it in bloom, that's going to be the easiest way to identify it. Okay, we're going to move to another summer annual that is kind of newer to Illinois and likely underreported on this map. So this is kind of the first one that I'm classifying as invasive. And with this term, a lot of it is because we're seeing it show up, and where it shows up it is in big patches, and it is kind of taking over and causing some issues. So we want to pay attention to this one and definitely report it if you see it so we can track where this one is at. But small carpet grass is going to be found in a lot of sunny, disturbed areas. And where we're finding it is in kind of our prairie restoration efforts or our wildflower plantings. So we have a little wildflower planting that we put out some native seeds, and then just we didn't really do a lot of work to eradicate the long grasses. We were kind of just going to see what happened. And a huge patch of this popped up. I know Chris has seen it pop up over at Dixon Springs and their prairie restoration that they're doing. So something to pay attention to. It likes sunny areas and disturbance. So if you're managing this with fire, it also likes that. It looks a little bit different. It's not kind of your typical grass because it has those really short, broad leaves that kind of clasp the stem. It is going to be hairy, so it's going to have hairy blades, hairy sheaths, a membranous ligule, and then again, it's going to have that raceme inflorescence with finger-like collections of on spikelets. The way that they're held is kind of like a turkey foot shape, like you get in a big blue stem, but on a completely different grass, right? This only gets up to about 2 feet tall, and it's very thin-stemmed. And kind of a weaker grass. Since it is an annual, it is one that if you go and give it a tug, it should pull pretty easily out of the ground too. So this one we include because we want you to be on the lookout for it and report it if you see it. You can upload your observations to EdMaps. That would be great. That's where that map is from that I showed you. But just a couple other views of this one. Again, that short, broad leaf that wraps around the stem and kind of clasps it at the base. You see all of those hairs kind of in the sunlight here, and you can kind of see them up close here as well. And then sometimes you get those hairs on the leaf sheath. You can see the color differentiation. It can have red stems, but doesn't always have the red stems. But if you do see that, that's a helpful clue. And then this close-up right here is of that membranous ligule, way close up on that leaf. Okay, again, a couple different views of this. So you can see this patch, this monoculture, we'll call it, because there's nothing else really growing there. It can really take over pretty quickly. And then, like I said, it's an annual, so it's going to drop those seeds there and then continue to come back. I don't quite know how long those seeds are viable in the soil, but that's something we should look up so we know what we're dealing with. And again, you can see kind of that turkey foot shape collection of spikelets over on the right. They do have awns, but again, with all the other characteristics we're looking at, you shouldn't need that one to be able to identify the carpet grass. I'm gonna go back 1 second because there is a lookalike grass that I want to mention for this one. We talked about deer tongue grass yesterday, and it similarly has a really broad leaf that clasps the base of the stem. It's going to get bigger than the carpet grass, and it is going to be up and growing actively earlier in the season. But you could find these in similar situations. It's also going to have hairy leaf blades and leaf sheaths, but it's going to have really stiff, bristly hairs, whereas the carpetgrass hairs are more silky and soft. So just wanted to point that one out. Maybe might confuse those. So look back at yesterday's and we can compare those side by side. Okay, we're going to move into stiltgrass. Stiltgrass is another invasive grass that we've been talking about for a while in Southern Illinois, and unfortunately, it is creeping its way up the state. This one is regulated in Illinois under the Illinois Exotic Weeds Act. So what that means is it is illegal to buy, sell, distribute, or plant it. And it is Stiltgrass is non-native. Yes, it is from um, Asia and was brought over as packing material for porcelain products. So that's kind of how it made its way here, I want to say, in like the 20s, maybe like 100 years ago. In Illinois, though, it's been here not quite as long as that. But we found it along a lot of our in our woods along near our rivers is where we saw it at first, but now it is spreading up. So the woods is where you typically find it, but I've seen it on roadsides and sunny areas. It was slowly creeping through lawns towards my lawn at my old house. So definitely not restricted to the woods, unfortunately. Um, and again, I don't know when, I don't think I pulled this map, updated it for this webinar. This might be an old version, so it's likely it could be in a few other spots. But it is another annual grass, but unlike a lot of the ones we've talked about, it's a warm season annual, and it has a really long growth window. So it'll start growing in the spring, but it won't flower until late summer into the fall. It can vary in its height, 1 to 3 feet tall, and it is a really weak-stemmed grass that has roots that do develop kind of above the ground on the lower stems. So kind of where we get that name Stiltgrass. Kind of hard to see in this photo, but if you did rip out a bunch, which I encourage you to do, you should see some roots that are above on the stem, the lower stem too. Okay, we look for very short, um, thin leaves, not in like how broad they are, but like how thin the actual leaf is. So it's another like weak leaf, I would describe it as. And it has an off-center silvery midrib, silvery to translucent midrib. And that's kind of the main characteristic that we use to identify stiltgrass. And it can also have hairs at the base of the leaf. It will put out a raceme inflorescence with those finger-like collections of spikelets, but I have seen it kind of vary in how it looks with that. And then I didn't include on here, but in the winter time, it gets the straw color, and oftentimes it grows in such dense mats that it forms this big thatch. So if you're out in the woods and you see a big straw-colored mass of grasses, it's a good clue that you might want to take a closer look because it's likely to be stiltgrass. Let's take a closer look at this one. So again, we can see here more on this leaf. We always want to look at multiple leaves for any characteristic, right? This midrib looks pretty close to center. This one here is more off center, but we can see kind of that silvery, translucent. Here we can kind of see some of those sparse hairs at the base of the blade. I wouldn't really categorize that as a ligule in this case. Those hairs, I would just say kind of at the base of that blade. And then a couple different views of it in bloom. I found this one. You can see I'm wearing a glove. So this was in like November. It was still blooming. But a lot of the times, this one's really robust. I see more of this more delicate collection of spikelets that are held here that are also really hard to take pictures of. So. There are a whole bunch of different look-alike plants, um, look-alike grasses, and other plants, grass-like plants. So things like a smartweed, if you just have the leaves and it's not in bloom, can look like a stiltgrass. There's some other woodland grasses that we didn't cover today that can look similar. We could also look at like that Nimblewill sometimes can look similar to a stiltgrass. So Chris is going to put kind of a really in-depth, if you want to pay attention to stiltgrass or think you might have stiltgrass, this guide is going to have more detail than we have in this presentation to kind of look into that one. Okay, we're going to move into cheatgrass next. So we're going to look at a couple different bromes. And we did look at a brome back on day one under the woodland plants, and it was that hairy woodland brome, which is a native brome. But most of the plants, most of the grasses in that genus are non-native to Illinois. So this one here, Bromus tectorum, I learned it as cheatgrass. I feel like most people in Illinois call it downy brome. Okay, so that's another name for it too. This one found in every county in Illinois, and we mostly refer to it and treat it as non-native, not necessarily a high priority for management. However, out in the western part of the US, it is actively managed as an invasive plant because it is extremely dense in a lot of our rangelands, and it produces a huge amount of thatch, seen as it's an annual, and has been contributing to changes in fire regimes. So definitely, if you're in the western part of the US, you might see this listed and managed as invasive, and for good reason. We don't really have it to that extent or that similar type of system here. So it's not really a higher priority. Okay, so we're gonna find it again in areas where you'd find a weed. So in our fields, roadsides, gardens. It is a winter annual, so it is going to be blooming very early in the season. Can get, again, depending on where it is, up to 3 feet tall. I typically see it under a foot. It is going to be a pretty hairy plant with that other common name, that downy brome. It has these kind of long, soft, silkier hairs all over the leaves and the leaf sheaths and the spikelets themselves. So the whole plant is pretty softly hairy. We're going to see a short membranous ligule that's not intact on the top, but that's kind of fringed. And sometimes when you see a fringed membranous ligule, it can look like a hairy ligule. So this might be one that it would be helpful to have a little hand lens to be able to see that up close to differentiate between like a hairy ligule and a membranous ligule. And then it's going to have a panicle inflorescence that as it matures, it will nod to one side as we see in the photo on the left here. So this is as it's kind of emerging in the middle, and then it's going to nod to the side. And then as it matures and as it dries out, those spikelets are going to kind of pop open into like a V shape. And they're going to stay in kind of that characteristic open V shape. And of course, they have awns on them too that we can see. And when it dries out, we can see that all of those awns are held kind of open. So this view right here is kind of the characteristic view that a lot of people see. Since it's a winter annual, definitely by this time of the year, this is what it looks like. This also is a problem for like grazing animals, right? All those awns can get kind of stuck. So if you have a huge amount of this in like a pasture, that would not be ideal. But again, in every county in Illinois, it's everywhere. Okay, so here's a couple views. So here's that ligule. So, at first glance, you might say, oh, it's a hairy ligule. But if we take a moment and look, it is a membrane. It's just fringed or kind of shredded on the top. And then hopefully we can see all these downy hairs. So they can be relatively short, kind of soft and velvety. We can see them on the leaf blades here. That's another view of that ligule back here. Okay, ignore this. That's a little barley. That's not a cheatgrass in the background of that picture here. Sometimes our nodes can be red, but not always. Okay, and then again, a couple different views of it in bloom, kind of early as it's actively, in that bloom phase. Again, you can see all the hairs, we can see the awns, we can see that curving downward facing, and then over here, as those seeds have developed and it dries out, it's going to pop open. Okay, so that's cheatgrass. We're going to look at smooth brome next. Another brome throughout Illinois. I have it listed as invasive. Kind of depends where you are on the state, if we treat it as invasive or just kind of accept it as another non-native. I find that it's a lot more of a problem in like northern Illinois. I see it in a lot of kind of prairie restorations. This is from one up in far northern Illinois that the dominant grass was smooth brome. So I would consider that maybe something we'd want to work towards adjusting if we can with some management. But disturbed areas, prairies, that's fine. This one. Another cool season grass typically stays under 3 feet tall. This one has a wide leaf with an M-shaped crimp in it. We'll see that in a second, and a short membranous ligule. It is going to produce a panicle inflorescence that will nod to one side. The spikelets, excuse me, start off kind of greenish red. They're kind of elongated, and then they're going to turn this straw color as we get into this time of year. Another characteristic you might be able to kind of pick up in this picture is as that grass senesces, those leaves are going to curl really tightly, and they form kind of a corkscrew shape. So we've talked about that in a couple other grasses, like in a poverty oat grass, we have that really tight corkscrew shape. We also talked about in the switchgrass, how you would find curling leaves as it senesces. Now, a switchgrass and a smooth brome you could find in the same place, but one's cool season, one's warm season, so they're going to be actively growing at different times. Um, Smooth brome is not going to be a bunch grass, whereas switchgrass is. So that should help you tell them apart too. Okay, so one of the most reliable characteristics that I would use for smooth brome when I was identifying it and it looked like this or early in the season is to look for and feel this M-shaped crimp. So I would run my finger down the blade, feel that crimp, and be like, smooth brome, done. Other grasses can have that. Sometimes smooth brome, like reliably, will always have that. That being said, just note we talked about grasses yesterday that are very sharp if you run your finger down the blade. So, looking at this one, it has a very smooth, shiny, weak looking leaf. So I did that first before I would look for that leaf characteristic. And then here you can see short membranous ligule. And then over here you can kind of see that those curled leaves, hopefully on some of those plants. Okay, a couple different views. Usually we don't, I usually don't catch it when it's in bloom like this, where that panicle is upright, everything is held out to the sides. You can see we've got some of the anthers and the stigmas that are hanging out, waiting to get wind pollinated, move that around. You can see that up close here. But the more typical form is when it nods to the side, holds all of those spikelets off to one side, and then turns this really like grayish color. It definitely not really straw. I say straw, but this one is like gray. And that's a little bit more distinctive for this grass too, is that gray color. Okay, we're gonna move next to reed canary grass. Reed canary is another invasive that we typically find in wetter areas, but that doesn't mean that you can't find it in other spots too. But typically, more of your swamps, marshes, moist meadows, moist prairies. Another cool season grass gets a little bit taller than the smooth brome, up to 5 feet. This is the one that I had the hardest time differentiating between the smooth brome because they were growing at the same time. They have similar type of leaves, kind of wider leaves, and the reed canary grass sometimes would have an M-shaped crimp. So that would throw me off. Telling this one apart from smooth brome, this one has a much taller membranous ligule, like double the height of the smooth brome. Again, that's kind of hard if you don't have them side by side. But as you look at it more, hopefully you can tell that difference. I would also find that a lot of the time, reed canary has more of like a bluish gray hue to its leaves, rather than the smooth brome that's typically like a really bright green. So color can be a little helpful with that. And when we look at this inflorescence, it is going to be a panicle, but it's a very narrow panicle that resembles a spike both before and after blooming. So this is it. This is it here as it's freshly emerged. It's just starting to kind of puff out those little branches right here that are densely covered in spikelets. And then over here, this is after blooming. I was going to say spike. That panicle resembles a spike and it turns like this golden orange color. If we're comparing this and smooth brome at this stage, very simple, right? But if we just have those leaf characteristics, it can be a lot more challenging to tell those apart. Okay, so closer view at reed canary grass. We can see kind of all of the leaves along the stem here, and you can see those membranous ligules even before you pull that leaf blade back. Okay, so here a couple of views. Again, this looks a lot different than the smooth brome. It is a lot taller, so that's one thing I use for differentiating them. And then a couple different views of it in flower, right? So this is going to be our panicle. We can see the branches here. We can sometimes get this like pinkish red color when it is actively blooming. This is kind of right after blooming, and then it's starting to turn yellow, and then it's going to turn this kind of orangey color and kind of hold those branches tight again and look more like a spike. Okay. I did have a question yesterday about comparing young reed canary grass and young Canada wild rye. I had to think about that one for a second. So, I did want to bring that up today. Um, Ligule size is going to be another clue for that one, just like with the smooth brome. That Canada wild rye is going to have a short membranous ligule and it often turns brown pretty quickly. Whereas reed canary, it can stay more of that white color longer and it's going to be a lot taller. And what we find too, I'm going to go back a slide, is in reed canary, if I can go back a slide, in reed canary, the leaves kind of really tightly clasp that stem, and kind of almost like clasp it, but not quite. And the wild rice typically aren't as tightly around the stem. That's a little bit more relative. That's one thing I would look for. We know the Canada wild rye can have those auricles, but sometimes they're really short or they fade away really fast. Um, and then I look at color. So reed canary can have that blue or gray color, whereas you're going to have those shinier green leaves in the wild rice that can kind of twist and show their underside. So a few different ways. I feel like that's achievable. I feel like we could tell them apart based on those characteristics. Okay, we're gonna charge ahead into our next one, into Johnsongrass. This one is invasive, was introduced in the 1800s, so it's been around for a long time. Was used for forage, and now we're finding that it's real tough to eradicate. So this one you're gonna find in a lot of pastures. It's on like nearly every roadside, it seems, in southern Illinois. It is a warm season grass and it's a pretty big, robust warm season grass. So this is going to be on par with our kind of our tall grass prairie grasses, right? That big blue, that switchgrass. Johnson grass is going to be on the same level when it comes to height. It is rhizomatous, which is great for us, right? One of the reasons why it's so good at being invasive. You can kind of see I plopped this one out of the ground. You can see those rhizomes that are growing and trying to spread and then pop up some new stems. This plant is going to have long, broad leaves with a white midrib. The leaves can be, over 2 feet long. And another thing we'll look at is that they just typically don't stay green. They look pretty sickly, pretty quickly. So we'll look at what that looks like. We're going to find a dense, hairy, velvety ligule. We're going to find something called glaucous stems. We'll look at that in a second. And then when it blooms, it is going to have a panicle inflorescence that's over a foot tall. And we're going to have kind of densely packed with spikelets with pointed tips. And they can have awns, although they don't always have awns. Okay, again, more of a southern Illinois, but there's scattered counties all the way up to the other end of the state. So I definitely pay attention for this one. And I don't think I mentioned it, but this one is regulated as a noxious weed. And it's also regulated under the Illinois seed law. So I think Chris placed a guide to those regulations in the chat. If you want to look at what all of that means, we can do that. Okay, so let's look at this one. A few things to look at in these pictures. Number one on this one is going to be that hairy, velvety ligule. I will say the Johnson grass is one of those grasses. I find it really tough to pull that leaf blade back from the stem. Like it's hard to get these pictures where it's intact. It kind of holds really tightly. Another different view over here of that ligule. We can kind of see that really strong white midrib in this photo as well as in this photo. And then hopefully you're seeing all of this like red, yellow, spotting, streaking. That's really typical in Johnson grass. So that's what I mean by it just looks sickly. It doesn't look like a healthy plant. And honestly, I use that as an identification characteristic in comparing it to like a switchgrass. I did talk about how the stems can be glaucous, and what that means is they can have this white powdery coating on them that acts kind of like a sunscreen. So you might be able to tell in this photo, I've wiped it away right here. But down here you can see kind of more of this white powdery coating kind of up here. And then if you were to kind of rub that off, you'd see like a little white powder on your hand. So that's another clue. There are some other grasses that can have that, so that's not like just a individual thing, but it's another clue you can look for in conjunction with these other characteristics. Okay, a few different views of it in bloom. So, right, it's going to have that panicle inflorescence, and we can see kind of a close-up view again. You can see there are a few awns, and this isn't in bloom, so we've got those anthers and those stigma. Okay, this one has a few lookalikes. So we're going to do a quiz. If you were here yesterday, we talked about switchgrass, we talked about gamma grass. There's a few different kind of characteristic things that kind of stick out for each of those grasses. So this is probably my trickiest quiz because I didn't focus on the inflorescence. But if you all want to make a guess, A, B, and C, which one is Johnson grass, which one is switchgrass, and which one is gamma grass? We'll take a minute or two, let you see what we remember from yesterday and combining it with what we're looking at today. All right, got some guesses coming in. Mhm. Awesome, awesome. Okay, I'm being a little more tricky this time, but we're gonna talk through it. So, most everyone got the Johnson grass, right? Which We just went over it, so hopefully that helped. Johnson grass is B in the middle, okay? And kind of the main clue that I left you with is that white midrib and kind of that coloration on the leaf, okay? It was kind of tricky. A over here is going to be gamma grass, okay? So gamma grass, remember, forms those really strong bunches that over time look like someone came and sat in the middle of it and pushed all those leaves out to the side. So we're just starting to see that here with some of that form. And then over here, this is going to be our switchgrass. So there are a few little panicles here, but this is starting to show, again, I was really tricky. There's a few of those curled dead leaves down right at the base here, but kind of hard to see. So again, good effort. A lot of you got it. Most of you got the Johnson grass, which is great. So other clues to tell them apart, right? The switchgrass and the Johnson grass, when they're in bloom, they look similar. Switchgrass, the spikelets are going to be larger. There's going to be a lot more of them. They're going to have awns. I don't know if I said switchgrass. I meant Johnson grass. Johnson grass. Larger, a little bit larger panicle, more spikelets, larger spikelets, awns. Switchgrass is going to be more delicate in its panicle. Kind of more branches versus spikelets is what I'm going to say. Very branched, smaller spikelets, not typically awned. Okay. The gamma grass and the Johnson grass are typically confused when they're in their vegetative form, okay? You can see in the gamma, there's some red color, red, blue, purpley on the tips of the leaves, okay? So you might be like, oh, that, I remember Erin said the leaves look kind of sickly. Maybe that's what that is. We're gonna look for differences in the hairy ligule is going to come in handy with these because the gamma grass can have a strong midrib too. So we're going to look for that velvety hairy ligule in the Johnson grass, whereas it was just a really, really short, barely even there hairy ligule in the gamma grass. So that's one of the things I would look at early in the growth season. Okay, we're going to move on next. Next one we're going to talk about, a lot of you may know just as Phragmites. And I got a little bit more specific with this one because technically this is a complicated grass. Technically, the invasive one we're looking at is a subspecies. So there's Phragmites australis that we call common reed. There's a few different subspecies. This one, Australis australis, is the European common reed. And this is the one the strain that we have seen taking over and having those invasive tendencies and causing issues. So there's kind of it has an interesting history because some of it, this other subspecies is native to the US. Okay. And Chris is going to put kind of a look-alike guide to compare that native strain versus the invasive strain. It's likely if you're seeing it in a really big planting in a really big colony along the roadside in a wetland area where it's just taking over, it's the invasive strain, right? We're going to see in like a higher quality wetland system would be where we'd find that native one. I've never seen the native strain. I've only ever seen the invasive one. So focusing on that, this grass can be found in wet areas. So anywhere you have moisture, it loves it. So swamps, marshes, along the roadsides in the lower areas. I say it can get up to 16 feet tall. I've seen other measurements that go even taller. So huge, robust grass. It is a warm season grass and it produces these huge broad leaves. So hopefully, for better or worse, you've seen a lot of my hand in the background in a lot of these pictures. So hopefully that helps just with like a size comparison too. Very broad leaves, very long leaves. These tend to have more of like a blue hue to them, blue-gray hue. And that's one of the ways you can kind of tell it apart from the native strain, which is going to be more like bright green rather than like the blue-gray. It's going to have a ligule of fringed hairs, And then it's going to produce, again, a huge panicle inflorescence, over a foot tall. We're looking more on like the Johnsongrass level and the size of the panicle. And the spikelets can be different colors, kind of purple to brown. As it senesces and dries, it's going to be brown. And they're really densely packed into there. This grass is rhizomatous and spreads like crazy. It's one of the grasses that if you do mechanical removal and you leave a little fragment of the stem, it can reroot and continue to grow. So definitely a problem. I put this distribution map up here, and again, I'm convinced it's underreported. I feel like it's likely in every county in Illinois. Okay, so a few views. Again, I call this a hairy ligule, but you could also say, well, Aaron, there was another grass that you said the hairs like that. You wouldn't consider a ligule. So we could call it a ligule. We could call it a tuft of white hairs at the base of the leaf blade. We know we're going to look in the collar region for some white hairs, okay? I do point this out. It can have a crimp in the leaves, like a few of the other grasses we've looked at today. Um, I don't know that I'd use that as an identification characteristic, but just kind of pointing it out. I got really focused on crimps and leaves at one point. And then here we can see it's kind of sparsely in this wet area, but all of this in the background is also more of that Phragmites. Okay, a few different views of the panicle. Again, the color variation can be strong. So these are both in like early stages of blooming. This one is brown. This one is like really brightly purple. But again, you can see just like how densely packed. There's tons of spikelets on those branches. And these heads are again over a foot tall. As it's emerging, this is just being pushed out. We can see everything's kind of arched to the side. That's kind of your typical form with the panicles that we see generally, and then it puffs out, and we'll kind of have more of that like tree form shape. Okay, so that's Phragmites. Okay. We're going to move into kind of more of like the pasture grasses. So again, like we talked about earlier, some of these are intentionally grown, right, for that purpose. And we're kind of talking about them as nuisance grasses in the context of like when it's not a pasture anymore, when we're trying to manage that after it, what happens next? They can be kind of challenging to work with. So non-native, cool season grass. This is going to kind of be the theme. Our non-native cool season grasses are kind of our pasture grasses. This one is going to stay, under 3 feet tall. It is in the Elemus genus. It has been in several other genera. This one's been moved around quite a bit. So the Elemus is the same as our Rise, right? We talked about those earlier, which means they have a short membranous ligule and auricles. Okay. This is gonna make it's called a raceme inflorescence. I would call this a spike. I don't really see the little pedicels or those little stalks that attach it to the stem. So if I was choosing this, I would say it's a spike-like raceme. Okay, you can kind of go either way. The spikelets do have short awns. If you're familiar with the wheat grasses, this does look very much like a western wheatgrass or some of those others. Um, Kind of more north and to the west, the wheatgrasses, there's a lot more of them than we have in Illinois. And telling them apart from quackgrass is quite difficult, and I don't really have a lot of those look-alike recommendations, unfortunately, for the wheatgrasses. But in Illinois, it's more likely that you're going to see the quackgrass. So here's a couple different views of that up close where we can see those auricles, okay? So those little arms, we can see them there. We can see one kind of right over here, kind of over here. Okay, and then a few different views of it in bloom, right? Again, this is where it's actively flowering. It's kind of puffed out, and then it'll kind of close those spikelets back up. We can see some short little awns along that. And yeah, I don't know. I might change my mind. I might just call it a spike. I don't see a little stalk where it's where it's attached there. Okay. This one, let's see, I had something I was gonna say. This one is regulated under the Illinois seed law. So that is going to regulate like the amount of weed seed that's allowed in seed mixes. So this one is regulated under that. So you can, again, look at that resource Chris shared and we'll send that out if you want to know the nitty-gritty of those regulations. Okay, our next one we're going to look at is Timothy. Timothy again. Same thing, non-native, cool season, about 4 feet tall. This one I find has a pretty tall membranous ligule, more like the reed canary grass. And then it's going to produce this spike inflorescence. And each of those little spikelets is going to have these extremely short kind of U-shaped awns. I can't remember if I put a picture of that in here. Another thing that you'll notice a lot of the times, but not always, is the spike is going to emerge like right out of, like, it seems like the leaf sheath, right? We can see this uppermost leaf right here, and that spike is like popping out of that leaf sheath. So it's kind of an interesting, like, arrangement of those leaves. It's very, very high up on the stem. I know Timothy because it's the grass that my guinea pigs love to eat. They love to eat the little seed heads, which apparently you weren't supposed to feed them because of the awns, but they loved it. Here we go. We've got that really tall membranous ligule. This is just a node. I think I'm just showing it's like smooth, not really, no hairs or anything on it. And then a few different views of it. So here we can see up close. I did do a close-up picture where if we took an individual spikelet like right here, we'd see like kind of that U-shaped form from those two tiny little awns. So could be potentially problematic from critters, right? Munching through that. And then again, we can see like this one right here. It's like waiting to bust out right there of that leaf sheath. This one's just coming out. So that's another potential identification if you're looking and you see before they're in bloom, but you see this really like puffy um, top of the grass right under a leaf blade. Could be a good clue that it might be Timothy. And then you could just peel that open too, right? And see if that inflorescence is inside. I do that all the time, is kind of like open it up and see like how far it's developed and if I can tell any clues from that. Okay, tall fescue is next. Again, really common in our fields. Also, there's a lot of different strains and varieties of it that are in our lawns, at least in the more southern part of the state. But this one can be problematic. I've seen it a lot in like restoration efforts. This one, it has switched its like nomenclature, so it's in a different genus. It used to be in the Festuca genus, and now it's in this one that I'm not going to attempt to say. So if you're wondering why that is, that's just switched and changed how it's classified. It is a cool season bunch grass, so you can kind of see all of the individual bunches here. Over time, those will kind of fill in, and that's where we get kind of more of our typical lawn, right? But if it's unmowed, it can grow up to 5 feet tall, and is a cool season. So this one is going to have a short membranous ligule. For this one, the leaves kind of have a really distinctive way that they're held on the stem. And that's kind of one of the main ways that I use to identify it. So they're really stiff and kind of sharply angled, um, and mostly found at the base of the grass. So they're going to be kind of like held like rungs on a ladder, but not that kind of perfect perpendicular shape. We'll look at what that looks like. It does have a panicle inflorescence that resembles a spike before and after blooming. Okay, so here's a few views of it. These are a cluster of stems here, and you can start to see these leaf blades that are pretty perpendicular to those stems. And they have like sometimes you can see this interesting like shape at the base of the leaf blade. I don't know how to describe it. It's not a horn, it's not an auricle. It's kind of this more U shape, but also sometimes it's like flat and not like that, but we just see that really strongly like angled. They're stiffly held out from the stem. It's always hard for me to describe this one, but it's really distinctive if you see it out in the field. Again, this one is a panicle, but looks like a spike. So really narrow branches that are held kind of tightly. We can see it's kind of holding those branches out here. This, it's more contracted. This is with it flowering, so we can see anthers and stigmas, male and female parts. Can have these short, very, very, very short little awns. And then this is another grass like the smooth brome that we looked at that's going to turn more gray in color once it's finished blooming. So getting to about August time of year, that's what that grass is going to look like. And it often does curve to the side as well once it has finished growing. So more gray color, curve to the side. Okay, our next pasture grass. We're almost there, folks. We've almost made it. We're almost to the end. The next one is orchard grass. So it has a great name, I think. Find it in a lot of old fields, pastures, disturbed areas. Cool season grass. This one's rhizomatous rather than a bunch. And it does have a keeled leaf blade and sheath. And we did talk about that yesterday, I think, with like a beaked panic grass. So that keeled in this way is going to refer to those structures looking like they were folded in half and retain that crease like a piece of paper. They also have a tall membranous ligule that's often shredded at the top. So we looked at that like fringed ligule. This one is very early in the season already going to look shredded. And then it has a panicle inflorescence. This one's kind of tricky with kind of these bushy tufts of spikelets. So over here, I mean, we'll look at a close-up picture. You might be able to see some branches, and then you got kind of these little tufts of spikelets. Again, found in every county in the state. So here's a picture of that tall membranous ligule that's in shreds, right? It's not in one piece. It's already shredded. And then this is a view of that keeled leaf sheath and leaf blade. Okay, so rather than this being like tightly wrapped around the stem, it's kind of like it's got that fold along the back of it. And then that fold does continue up that whole leaf blade, right? Kentucky bluegrass, we talked about the keeled tip of the leaf. So like the whole leaf isn't keeled, just the tip to make that boat shape. This is going to be more of the blade and the sheath. Okay, then a few different views of it in bloom. So here we can see those long branches held out to the side. Sometimes they're held upright again, and then this is it in full bloom, so it's a little puffed out and looks a little bit different. So I include all of these pictures because sometimes, right, you might see this and be like, well, that doesn't look like orchard grass. That looks a little different. So whenever I have them, hopefully that helps show it in a few different stages. This one I find does get more of that gray color too when it senesces and dies back. Okay, I'm going to give you another tricky quiz. We're going to use just some vegetative characteristics. I put the answers up at the top because there's four possible ones, which I realize my face might be covering them. So tall fescue, timothy, orchardgrass, and quackgrass. Go ahead and put your guesses, A, B, C, and D in the chat. And then we'll just have two more grasses and we'll wrap up for today. So go ahead, take a minute. Tall fescue, timothy, orchard, and quack. Right, we got some answers coming in. We're getting tricky. We're getting tricky at this point in the day. I know, third day, last half hour, and I'm giving you the hardest quiz I think we've had so far. Okay, I'll give it another 30 seconds. It's okay if you don't know. This is a lot. It's so much information. It's a lot. I understand I'm not expecting you to leave today having learned all 50 grasses that we covered. But hopefully having the resources that great reference for you as you move forward. But let's go through these. In picture A, the characteristic we're looking at is that shredded ligule, that tall shredded ligule. So that means that that is going to be our orchard grass. I need to make sure I say it correctly. Um, B, we're looking at the little oracles that are kind of hard to see. They're not completely in focus here. We're looking at those oracles, which means this is going to be our quack grass. C, we're looking at that kind of bulging leaf sheath under a terminal leaf right at the top of that plant. That's going to be our Timothy that's just getting ready to bloom. And then that means that the way these leaves are held out from the stem like that I say is super characteristic and it'll help you, I promise. That's the tall fescue. Great job. A lot of you got that correct. So I'm impressed. You did excellent. Okay, we've got two more, and then we'll do another quiz review of the whole day and then take your questions. So next we're going to look at barnyard grass, the echinocloa. This is a native grass. And I kind of struggled where to put this because a lot of folks will kind of plant this in wetter areas to for waterfowl as a food source. But in a lot of other cases, it's weedy, and I kind of put it here because this has been one of the weeds that has come up in the compost that I got this year. So I am dealing with a lot of barnyard grass coming up in my gardens. So native grass, but found in a lot of disturbed areas, along waterways, and kind of wetter areas. It is a summer annual. And it can get quite tall, so up to 4 feet tall. One of the ways I've been identifying this one is at the base of the stem and the base of the leaf blades can be pink in color, right? So a lot of times in our home gardens, we don't wait for a grass to flower. We're like, oh, that's a weed because it's growing where I don't want it, and we pull it out. I missed some, so they did get to flowering stage, and I was convinced that it was barnyard grass. But then I'm noticing other things about it, right? And so that pink color was something new. This one will typically have more of a translucent midrib on the leaf, but the biggest clue that I use, this is the only grass that we've talked about over these 3 days that does not have a ligule. There have been some that look like they don't have a ligule because it's so small, but this one, it's just got a smooth raised surface, no ligule in sight. It does produce a panicle inflorescence with these branches that are densely packed with kind of these pear-shaped spikelets that are hairy. And there's a few different subspecies of this one. So sometimes they have awns and sometimes they don't. Okay, so a few views. Right here, we see that translucent midrib. We see the lack of any sort of ligule. You can see how it's just completely smooth. There's no like strong line. There's like a color line, right? But some of them it's just like you can tell there's like a raised surface or a line that's just like a really, really short membrane, right? And here it's completely smooth. And then a few different views of it in bloom. So I do have a photo over here. This is the awnless variety for the most part. And I believe these are hairs, not awns, but you can see for the most part, we just have pear-shaped spikelets on branches. Whereas over here, you can see all of those awns that are present. I do find a lot of color variation with this. It can have this like deep red to kind of purple spikelet, or even just the awns. So it can kind of vary in that way too. So yeah, kind of interesting. This one, like I said, planted a lot of times as a food source, and it's got these like hairy on seeds. So you wouldn't think that that would be something that would be a preferred food for waterfowl, but it is. Okay, and our last one, this one's not really super common, but I think it looks really cool. So I put it in here as our last grass because I think it's kind of fun. Velvet grass stands up to its name. It is the most velvety soft grass that I have ever come across and has this really strong silver color. So it's really, really distinctive and stands out. It is not native, unfortunately. And it does like moist, disturbed areas, cool bunch season grass under 4 feet tall, and everything, nearly everything, the leaf blades, the leaf sheaths, even the stems, so both the sheath and the stem and the nodes are covered in short white velvety hairs. Um, Obviously, we can see that silver color. It's going to have a tall membranous ligule, panicle inflorescence, and those silvery to light pink spikelets, kind of scattered throughout Illinois. Okay, so here's a close-up view. Again, this is just a fun grass. I think it's fun. We've got a tall membranous ligule, and then you can see all those velvety hairs, right? We can see here it's on the leaf sheath, but even as we start a new stem tucked in, right? It's hairy, the nodes are hairy, the leaves are hairy. It's just a very soft grass. And then a couple views of that panicle, right? Very silvery and still really silky. This is one that's a little bit more green in color, but typically I think that also might just be the lighting that I got in my camera, but typically more silver in color. So velvet grass. I'm curious if anyone's seen this one before. If you have, put it in the chat because that was a new one for me and no one that I've talked to has seen that one either. Okay, but we're going to end today. We've got about 20 minutes left, so we're going to go through, as usual, our review. I know some folks might have to leave, so I'm going to see if Chris can put that evaluation link in the chat if you wouldn't mind grabbing that before you go. We're going to go through a review and then we'll take some questions. So if you want to put in the chat an example of a grass that we covered today that has bristles. We covered two of those. Go ahead and drop that in. We'll test your knowledge at the end of the day. I should have done a review across all 3 days, but even that was too much for me to think about and process. So we'll keep it to the 23 we covered today. All right. Oh no, is my survey not working? Well, thank you for trying. I will work on that and I will email it out to you all. So we'll get that again. We'll get that fixed. No problem. Okay, giant foxtail, yellow foxtail both had the bristles. Excellent job. Give me an example of a grass that has a raceme. Raceme inflorescence. Okay, I see some coming in the chat, some stiltgrass, some crabgrass. Excellent. We could also put that carpetgrass. Remember that one? That one was also a raceme. We'll put that one in there. Okay, next, we should have a lot of options for this one. What grasses did we look at today that had awns? Looking for grasses with awns. Okay, excellent. Got some coming in. The squirreltail, our timothy, our little barley. Excellent. We had quite a few. Okay, the cheatgrass, remember that one? Nimblewill, barnyard, sometimes, not always. Johnsongrass, again, sometimes, not always. Excellent. How about a grass that was an annual? You know, we don't use that a lot of the times as an identification characteristic, but sometimes, especially with a grass that we think is a nuisance grass, give it a little tug and see if it pulls out of the ground easily. We got our bluegrasses, crabgrass, thank goodness. I know, right? So we covered a lot, right? A lot of annuals. Our nuisance grasses make sense. They are readily seed. They grow. A lot of them are early season annuals. They grow early and green up. And then some of our more problematic invasives, like the stiltgrass, are ones that we're watching real close, like that carpetgrass. Okay, give an example of a grass that spreads through rhizomes. Spreads through rhizomes. The Phragmites, all the worst ones. I know, isn't that the truth? Reed canary grass, Johnson grass, Phragmites. Yes, yes, yes. Those are kind of the three that came to mind. There may have been others, but those three for sure. And definitely those are some of our most challenging ones. Okay, I'm going to wrap it up just by briefly sharing this last slide with some resources. We also have talked about how iNaturalist is fantastic, has gotten a lot better with grasses. But these are great sources out there for future reference. And then again, all of my resources are kind of under the heading Grasses at a Glance, and you can find all that at go.illinois.edu/grasses. So I am finding the direct survey link is working for me. So I'm going to put that one in the chat and I'll work out that short URL and why that's not working. So if you want to take this one, you can. Or like I said, I'll double check that and look into that and resend that one out in an email. And I'll also include it when we send out the recordings. So I want to say thank you so much for joining me for this 3-day deep dive 6-hour course into grasses. I can't believe the response and the interest, so I really do appreciate you being here. You make it where I'm able to do this and offer it. I wish I could have you all come visit me in Southern Illinois and we spent a whole field day, but I know that's impossible for many of us. So do appreciate you coming. Chris, I'm gonna open it up for questions, if we have some. I noticed you were answering a lot of them, so I appreciate you in the background helping me out with that. But what do we still have?
Sure, we've got a number, and a couple are just one I wanted to start with was somebody asked that all the resources that we've been putting in the chat, can you include those with your follow-up email?
Sure. Yes.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay. Can you define what a bunch grass is? You use that term some.
Yeah, so bunch grasses are typically going to grow like it sounds, in a bunch or in a clump. So kind of like that picture I have on the screen, like a little blue stem, they're going to have that growth form. And a lot of that is in contrast to more of our rhizomatous grasses that are going to be like more spreading grasses that are going to form colonies. So versus the bunch grasses.
Great. Are there native grasses with that M-shaped crimp? You showed a couple of the nuisance ones.
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know off the top of my head. Um, Not any of I don't think, none of the ones that we've covered over the course of this course. At least it wasn't like a strong, reliable characteristic. I think I see it more in those non-natives. Mhm.
Okay, great. Somebody said the bluegrass ligules that you showed with the Kentucky bluegrass look pointed, like really sharply pointed. Was that just an artifact of the picture, or is that really like is that a common characteristic? Is that common?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not sure. I'd have to look into that to see. Because I know with like the fringing, right, or the like tearing of them, that's kind of characteristic. I don't know. I never actually really thought about it, so it's possible.
Okay, great. We did have a question about clarifying a use of habitat term. So you said this is some of these were found in degraded prairies, and people wanted to know, is that a remnant prairie or a restoration, or like what do you mean when you talk about degraded prairies?
Right. So in a lot of instances, that's not going to be our remnant prairies, right? A lot, some of our remnant prairies are still high quality, right? And they are don't have a lot of invasives in them. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of remnant prairie left in Illinois, right? We kind of talked about that yesterday, that it's nearly all gone, right? Just with our land use changes in agriculture. So a lot of the degraded prairies is going to be, could be remnants that got very small and then were invaded. It could be a lot of our restorations. We would also see like railroad right of ways and kind of those habitats too. We could kind of put into that classification. Yeah. We did use a lot of different like habitat type terms. So that's something for me to think about clarifying in the future. So thank you for that feedback.
And somebody asked about the foxtail barley. Is another common name like a witch's broom grass?
I haven't heard that in reference to that grass, but that doesn't mean that it's not possible. Which grass, which I didn't talk about, and sometimes I do just because it fits with the name of the webinar series. Which grass is one that's going to be one of the love grasses, like the purple love grass we talked about. So I don't know if that's more like the witch's broom. I'd have to look into that. And like we talked about, there's a lot of common names and they can easily be confused among grasses or even repeat among completely different grasses.
Great, thank you. Other than that, there was a lot of discussion in the chat about scientific names and particularly with called fescue and is that different species or is that just like a change of the name over the time?
It was a change in the name, and I am not great at staying up to date on when names change and why they change. A lot of the times, right, a lot of the names that we have and like the names come back to like the relationships, right? Like how the plants are related to one another. And then now we have a lot more like genetic data. So that's being used a lot to kind of reclassify plants. Like we're learning more, right? Like science, we're always learning, we're always evolving, we're always changing. So a lot of the times as research is ongoing, we find out new clues. And then we're like, oh, well, that actually is more closely related to this other group of plants. So that name will change, that scientific name will change because the way we understand how those plants are related to one another has evolved. So that's where a lot of the name changes come. But for us, it can be frustrating, right? When you learn one name and then you're like, oh, it's this different one. And oftentimes it just happens to be something that's way more difficult to pronounce. That's what I
Sure,
find. So,
sure. Another question that just came in was about zoysia grass. So have you ever seen that outside of a lawn setting?
I personally have not. Um, that doesn't mean that it's not possible. But I have not.
Okay, great. Um, what about the barnyard grasses? I know there's a couple different species. There's one that's more of like a true wetland plant, another one's a weedier one. Is there easy ways to tell those barnyard grasses apart?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know off the top of my head. I think at one point I did a blog on that and I researched it and wrote it all down, and that's not in my brain anymore. So you could check my blog, Grasses at a Glance, and look for barnyard grasses. Either I did that or I was intending to do it. So if it's not there, thank you for that idea, and I will look into that for the future.
All right. That's most of the questions. I think we've had a few other questions about management that we've answered in the chat.
Okay.
But I think those are most of the ID questions. So thank you so much for that.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Chris, for helping me out today. And again, I just want to say thank you to everyone for joining us for the series. Appreciate you.